Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. It is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, if you're listening to this in real time. If you're not, then the Feast of the Immaculate Conception happened on December 8th. And in this episode, we are going to look at an angle of this feast that I think most people don't typically think about, and how cool it is, and how it really elevates the dignity of sex in marriage, and how we can just recognize how the church really celebrates the dignity of sex in a married couple. Welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy, the podcast for Catholic women that helps you improve your sex life, strengthen your marriage, and embrace God's design for love. All right, so I'm actually recording this episode in November. I am excited for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception because this is probably my favorite solemnity that the church has. Of course, we have the solemnity of Christmas and we have the solemnity of Easter, and, those are obviously our very, very high feasts. But the solemnity of the Immaculate Conception is so particularly unique, and I just love it. A lot of times when we think about the Feast of the Immaculate Conception is a Marian feast, rightly so. Mary told Saint Bernadette at Lourdes, "I am the Immaculate Conception," right? So this is a Marian feast day. Mary is the Immaculate Conception. But here's what we don't typically think about when we think about the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception is Mary being conceived immaculately. And how does conception happen? Conception happens because of sex. So yes, absolutely, we are celebrating Mary as the Immaculate Conception. But we are also celebrating the union of a husband and wife. We are celebrating the marriage bed of Anne and Joachim, Mary's parents. I have this really cool icon that I keep in my office, and it is an icon of the Immaculate Conception, but it's not your typical Immaculate Conception icon, which is an icon of Mary. This Immaculate Conception icon is Saint Anne and Saint Joachim embracing in front of their bed. So this is the act of the Immaculate Conception. This is the act which allowed for the Immaculate Conception to happen, which allowed God to immaculately conceive Mary. Because Mary couldn't have been immaculately conceived without the act, the marital act. See, God chose to come into the world through a woman who was conceived by human parents. God elevated the dignity of the sexual act so much in Anne and Joachim that their marital bond was able to, was open enough to God's grace to allow him to immaculately conceive Mary because of that bond. Whoa, that's really, really cool. One time, a couple of years ago, I got to ask Christopher West my question, my fun question that I've posed. I typically pose this on Instagram on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception because I think it's just fun and it creates a great conversation. But my question is, who had better sex? Adam and Eve before the fall, or Anne and Joachim at the Immaculate Conception? And when I asked Christopher West this, he just you could see his mind being blown. And he was just like, oh my gosh. It was, Anne and Joachim probably, we can only assume here, right? But Anne and Joachim probably got to experience the deep level of unity that Adam and Eve got to experience before the fall. God allowed the veil of sin to be lifted from this union so that Mary could be immaculately conceived in this union. God allowed this union of Anne and Joachim to be perfected, through his grace, not by any, perfect act of Anne and Joachim, right? Because they're still fallen human beings. But they came to this act so freely, so totally, so faithfully that it was able to be fruitful in a perfect way. Truly perfect, right? Because Mary was immaculately conceived. She was conceived without the stain of original sin. This conception was perfect. And Anne and Joachim were able to, they were participants in that. They had to come together to make it happen. Mary is, the daughter of Anne and Joachim. She's not like the daughter of Anne and the Holy Spirit, right? Because when we get into Christology and we understand Joseph was the foster father of Jesus, right? He wasn't the biological father of Jesus. Mary was the biological mother of Jesus, but the Holy Spirit was able to the Holy Spirit came upon Mary and overshadowed her. And that's how the Annunciation happened, the conception of Jesus. That's not what happened in the Immaculate Conception. In the Immaculate Conception, we had Anne and Joachim in a truly human way conceiving Mary. What? I just imagine the pleasure they experienced. Imagine the joy, the unity, the freedom. That right there, the Immaculate Conception, that's what we're aiming for. That's what we want our sex lives to be. That's our goal. Because in that act, God lifted the veil of original sin. He allowed them to participate in the act in the most full way that two human beings have ever in the history of the world post-fall have ever been able to experience it. Whoa, that's so cool. That's so cool. I really hope you guys are freaking out with me right now because I think it's amazing. And this is why in the work that I do, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception is my favorite feast because the church it's a solemnity. It is the highest level of feast that we can have. It is a solemnity. It's typically a holy day of obligation, right? So we're all going to Mass. And we're going to Mass and we are celebrating two human beings having sex. That's cool, right? So please, when you go to Mass today, or maybe you already have now that you're listening to this, but next year, if you've already been to Mass, next year on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, just really allow yourself to meditate on that in Mass. That God so elevated the marital union that he allowed Anne and Joachim to experience it in such a perfect way that Mary, the Mother of God, the living tabernacle, was conceived in that act of sex. That's so cool. All right. Happy feast. I recorded this episode significantly in advance of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception because actually, as you listen to this episode, if you're listening in real time, I am actually in Rome right now. So I am getting to celebrate the Feast of the Immaculate Conception in Rome, which I hear is amazing. And I will tell you about after I get back. But how cool that I get to celebrate my favorite solemnity in Rome on the Jubilee year. God is so good, you guys. God is so good. It is insane. Happy Feast of the Immaculate Conception, everybody. Thanks so much for listening. If you have ever gotten any value from this podcast, could you do me a favor really quick? Go into the podcast app that you are listening in, and if it gives you an option to rate and review, please rate and review this podcast. It helps us so much in reaching new listeners and spreading the word about this podcast. Thanks so much for listening.